Audio check. Teams audio check. Right, good morning everybody. Inquiry is resumed. I see we've got a number of people on Teams, including, as yesterday, my colleague Inspector Young. I think I've only got one brief housekeeping matter to mention. You'll remember that there's been some correspondence and debate at the Highways Condition session related to Highways England, what are they called, National Highways, and their view on the M5 junction condition. We'll circulate it around, but we received yesterday a note from National Highways saying that they're going to put together a paper on that, and when did that need to come in by, and we have said 24th of September, which I hope is next Friday when the inquiry isn't sitting. So 24th of September, we've asked them to put that paper in, and obviously we can see what it says. The email that the programme officer will copy round isn't 100% clear as to whether or not they're intending to attend the conditions session. But what we've said to them is that if they do want to come along, which I'm sure would be helpful, they ought to keep in touch with the programme officer because we don't know exactly when that session is going to be. But anyway, you'll see the very short email exchange very soon, but 24th September anyway. Any housekeeping matters from anybody? No? Okay. Now, today we are hearing, obviously, in a moment, the evidence from Mr. Renshaw for Balper and then from Mr. Hatton. Then we're moving on to Ms. Sutherland, and then we're beginning the case for ex-R elders in the person of Ms. Beth. And that's as far as we're going to get today. Tomorrow, obviously, we're hearing from quite a large number, I think it's about 50, individual unrepresented local residents and others. I know that the programme officer has got a note of who they are and when they're going to appear. She's working on that, nodding at the back of the room, and we'll circulate it around just for people's information. But I think we've got something around 50 people, a split between physical and virtual. And I mean, I'll say this to anybody who's listening at the moment, we are going to have to be quite strict on time on that. We've said 10 minutes per person. Previous experience actually says that some people will only take 4 or 5 minutes, which is absolutely fine, but we're going to have to be fairly ruthless on the 10-minute thing because otherwise we will be running into difficulties. There is one exception to that. There's a Mr. Osborne who has put in not only his own letter, email, statement, but he's also put in a technical report from a noise consultant. So in his case, I'm not sure if he wants to go through that report or indeed if he's able to do so, but we've given him 20 minutes because there's a bit more material there than for other residents. So that's today and tomorrow, and we'll worry about Friday when we get there. So given there's nothing else, Mr. Renshaw, from a quick conversation just now, I gather you're advocating yourself, as it were, in your case, and then when you move on to your colleague, you're going to be acting as the advocate. So, over to you, Mr. Renshaw.
Thank you. Good morning. My name's Andrew Renshaw. I'm a chartered town planner and have been in practice in the town planning profession for the last 40 years in both public and private sectors. I hold an MA in environmental planning from Nottingham University and have been a member of the Royal Town Planning Institute for over 35 years. I've 14 years' experience of working for planning authorities, mainly in development management. I've been acting for Balper since September 2018, when I was first approached in respect of an earlier planning application related to airport car parking. The evidence which I've prepared in this proof, the proof is true, and I confirm that the opinions expressed are my true and professional opinions. My evidence explains why I consider that the relocation of staff parking has not been one of the options considered by the appellant in terms of the sequential test undertaken in respect of car parking in the Greenbelt. And this, in my view, undermines the case for very special circumstances to overcome the issue of inappropriate development in the Greenbelt in relation to car parking. If I could take you to my
Well, yeah, I know, basically.
paragraph.
Hang on, Chris.
Yeah.
So,
It hurt.
I think that was Mr. Remain, but he's now muted. Okay, sorry, you were just taking us to somewhere, but I never found out where it was.
Paragraph 512 of my proof,
Yep.
which refers to Ball's statement that very special circumstances for the development of land in the Greenbelt for additional passenger car parking are that, firstly, there's a need for additional low-cost parking to meet demand associated with the 2 million PPA, to address the unauthorised parking in the Greenbelt, and as part of a holistic approach to sustainable travel, and then the lack of alternative available suitable sites for parking outside the Greenbelt, and the need for the benefits of the growth of the airport. Now, moving on to 514, I say the parking demand study anticipates a growing proportion of passengers preferring low-cost parking. Now, the appellant's case regarding expanding expanding car parking in the Greenbelt is constructed around the need to expand low-cost parking, because Ball argues that this is the primary need and lack of provision would result in more cars being parked off-site in unauthorised car parks to the detriment of the environment and the openness of the Greenbelt. Now, in both Mr. Witchell's and Mr. Melling's proofs of evidence in justifying the proposed extension to the Silver Zone car parking, the need for low-cost parking comes up time and time again. Perhaps I could take you to paragraph 5531 of Mr. Melling's proof. That's page 112, and it is CD 7/2. And here it says, at this stage, it is anticipated that Ball's car parking proposals to the south of the airport site will be brought forward ahead of MSCP3 during phase 2. Both the parking demand study and parking demand study update have identified that whilst all components of the appeal proposal are necessary to meet forecast parking demand, given the differences between the types of car parking proposed from a product and likely customer cost perspective and the forecast availability of premium parking capacity, a low-cost parking option will better meet customer needs and benefit from greater levels of underlying demand, while also being better positioned to reduce the market share of unauthorised off-site providers. The PDSU concludes that for these reasons, low-cost car parking provision to the south of the airport is a more practical first step to develop additional parking capacity at the airport. Now, in my proof at 611, I say, in response to the appeal application, BALPA submitted an objection by letter. It's in North Somerset Council on the 25th of January 2019. That's in my Appendix 14. It argued that the expansion of the Silver Zone car parking in the Greenbelt could not be justified, as staff were now occupying 1,000 spaces in an area that could have been made available to meet low-cost parking demand. Furthermore, because staff have to park conventionally, it was estimated that if used for block parking of passenger cars, 1,400 car spaces could be made available by relocating staff car parking back to Northside, where the majority of the staff actually work. This was expanded upon in BALPA's statement of case, at paragraphs 218 and 219, and I consider that the failure to address this undermines the appellant's very special circumstances case. Now, if I might comment, I should say that this was not the first time that the argument in relation to Greenbelt impact had been put by BALPA. It had previously raised an objection to the application for all year round use of the seasonal car park in 2018. Its letter, which I included in my Appendix 11, and was actually submitted before I was appointed by BALPA and before the staff parking moved into the Silver Zone. And here you'll see that they queried whether very special circumstances existed for all year round use of the Cogloop 1 site in the Greenbelt, because BAL were about to remove low-cost spaces in the silver zone to reallocate to staff. Now, when BALPA submitted its application for Rule 6 status, BAL got in touch with BALPA's head of organisation, and it was agreed to have a meeting to discuss BALPA's position. That meeting finally occurred the week before the inquiry opened, and BAL confirmed that they had no intention of considering BALPA's proposal to use the staff parking area as part of the silver zone passenger parking. Now, if parking demand is as forecast by BAL, notwithstanding public transport improvements, and as yesterday we all know how difficult forecasting can be, BALPA's approach may not avoid the need for some encroachment onto the Greenbelt, but what I believe it does is that BALPA's proposal gets over the problem that if, as Mr. Melling states in his proof that MSCP2 will be built first, it's clear that that MSCP2 will not cater for low-cost parking. And MSCP2 is the car park which already has extant permission from the 2011 consent. Now, increased low-cost parking, as BAL stresses, will help to reduce the demand for off-site car parking in unauthorised Greenbelt car parks. So building MSCP2 is not going to help that argument, because parking there will have to attract a premium price, even if it is lower than perhaps BAL would like. But without the need for planning permission, I consider that the current staff car park could be given over to low-cost parking, and that's an option that continues to be overlooked. And the history of development of parking at the airport is that the demand for and construction cost of spaces at the multi-storey car parks does not favour bringing forward such spaces until demand can be guaranteed. So one added benefit of staff parking within the long stay parking area Northside is that it will displace some long stay parking, stimulating demand for development and use of multi-storey car parks by those who are willing to pay more for the convenience of parking in a more secure site close to the terminal. Going on back to my proof at 615, I say that John Hatton will explain in his evidence how more efficient use of the existing staff parking area can be achieved, and will also examine the cost implications to BAL of staff reverting to parking in the north side. His analysis suggests that the apparent loss of income from staff occupying spaces north side would at most peak times be no more than that lost from occupying space in the silver zone, and sometimes it would be less. The analysis, of course, does not take into account the additional cost to BAL of providing buses and drivers to transport staff from the parking area to the terminal buildings and vice versa. In short, it is unlikely that there would be any significant loss of income by staff occupying spaces in the long stay or premium areas. So looking at the available sites outside the Greenbelt at 817 in my proof, I say that it is agreed that BAL went through a sequential approach to identifying possible sites and possible suitable and available sites for car parking outside the Greenbelt. But of course, sites may come forward in the future, in the next 10 years. And then at 818, I acknowledge that BALPA's solution makes no difference to the strategy of providing a further multi-storey car park in the Greenbelt inset, but helps to make maximum use of the car parking provided there. It, at the very least, defers the need to extend the Phase 2 site in the Greenbelt. That is the 2,700 spaces. And the amount by which it might need to be extended, or it might possibly defer the year-round use of the seasonal car park. So there are other potential benefits from the strategy BALPA is suggesting. And at 819 I say BAL at paragraph 922 of its statement of case in promoting arguments in favour of Phase 2 site, notes in the first bullet point that it is well located from an operational perspective, allowing car parking to the south of the airport to be consolidated in one location, while BALPA's proposal achieves the same situation. And then the next paragraph, the second bullet point notes that the Phase 2 site benefits from existing services and facilities associated with the Silver Zone car park. Well, the same applies to the current staff parking area, which was previously used for passenger car parking. And the third bullet point, going on, 8.1.11, is the third bullet point, says that the Phase 2 site is well suited to block parking where public access is not required. Well, the same situation clearly applies to the staff car parking area. And if I might make some comments on other matters in relation to the material benefits from the option that BALPA are putting forward, I considered those at 621 and 623 of my proof.
Yeah.
And I referred here in 621 to the additional daily staff vehicle movements on the A38 between the main entrance and the Silver Zone entrance. Now, I notice in Mr. Melling's rebuttal, he disputes the distance, the additional driving distance, and I acknowledge that the measurements he makes in terms of the overall journey are that there is actually very little difference, but of course there is the additional journeys up and down the public highway which North Somerset Council mentioned. But at 623, I refer to the mileage run by the park and ride buses, which I've calculated at a staggering 150,000, well, in excess of 150,000 miles per annum, and that would be avoided again with the strategy that BALPA are putting forward. At paragraph 719 of my proof, I note that the council officers picked up on the unsustainable location of staff parking, but they did not consider the Greenbelt policy perspective. At 719, I say that the Planning and Regulatory Committee report noted at page 91, a more sustainable parking balance would see some of the 1,000 spaces relocated to the north side of the airport. BAL reject this option. And I then pointed out at paragraph 7110 that this response misses the crucial planning points that BALPA have been making in their representations. Firstly, that staff are occupying the very spaces that BAL need for low-cost passenger parking, that this means that unnecessary additional Greenbelt land is given over to low-cost parking, that it results in additional and longer trips on the road network, and the potential implications that I referred to previously in the highway evidence about the potential implications of the failure to allow any increase in staff car parking, and then the final point which inspectors have advised is not admissible evidence. So looking at the planning status quo, the fallback position, it's clear that since the granting of outline planning permission in 2011, so this is paragraph 832, it is clear that changes to the parking strategy at the airport since the granting of outline planning permission in 2011 have occurred for a number of reasons. And I consider that the implications are relevant to the determination of the appeal. Firstly, there's been a significant change from the early provision of parking in multi-storey car parks to the early development of low-cost parking in the Greenbelt. And by that, I'm referring to the subsequent delay to the phasing of construction of the multi-storey car parks following the 2011 planning permission. The decision to relocate staff parking has reduced the availability of low-cost parking, and that's referred to in the parking demand study, the parking demand study addendum, I believe. So too have other changes, such as the development of BAL's administrative offices in the Silver Zone area. Again, further spaces which would have been low-cost parking spaces have been lost. So really, to conclude, my evidence suggests a simple means to reduce the impact on the openness of the Greenbelt by a reallocation of parking spaces. This will make better use of the Greenbelt inset for parking, given the spare parking capacity which has been identified there. It would also provide a greater incentive to construct the additional multi-storey car parks in the inset area by more intensive use of the Northside area for parking. Now, BAL is now proposing a draft planning condition which, in relation to the supply of passenger car parking, which they refer to as monitor and manage. And that involves providing a parking demand and capacity report, I think it is within 12 months of the commencement of development and annually thereafter. And that would review parking demand in all sectors, would review the public transport mode share and other matters. Now, in principle, BALPA welcomes that approach, but of course it has two reservations. Firstly, what happens if the council disagrees with the strategy proposed by BAL on receipt of the annual report? And more particularly, the condition in BALPA's view should provide for a review of the location of low-cost parking, including the strategy proposed by BALPA in respect of staff parking. So as set out in 5460 of Mr. Melling's proof, I think the thinking is that monitor and manage would take into account capacity that an authorised possible additional park and ride site off-site would generate, but it doesn't specifically refer to other arrangements for low-cost parking. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Ms. Noble, over to you.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, Mr. Renshaw.
Morning.
You gave evidence during the Highways Week, so I'm going to try not to go over any of the ground that we discussed then. The focus of the questions I'll ask you is on your point 1 in paragraph 2.1.3 of your proof. And that's where you say that the location of staff parking within the southern area of the airport within the Greenbelt undermines the very special circumstances case. So if we can turn to section 6 of your proof, this is where you outline BALPA's objections to the appeal application. And at paragraph 6.1.1, you make the same point there, that further parking in the Greenbelt can't be justified because staff parking area, which is currently in the Silver Zone, is available to meet the demand. And you say that that could provide 1,400 car parking spaces.
Yes.
So I just want to explore with you whether it would remove the need for the Silver Zone extension or not. Just a few matters that we discussed last time. First of all, I think we were in agreement that you were not challenging the calculation of the overall number of car parking spaces required. That's correct, isn't it?
That's correct, yes. I mean, the only issue I would have there is that I don't think those numbers that came out of the parking demand study, the update was actually 400 spaces fewer than the original parking demand study. So there's 400 spaces floating around there potentially that, again, might not be required in the from the original planning application. And then there's the question of public transport mode share, whether that might reduce the numbers actually seeking the parking at the airport by the 12 million passengers per annum. So, as I think was said yesterday, very difficult to forecast, but on the basis that your forecasts were correct, I cannot disagree.
I think last time you agreed with me that you're not challenging the overall calculation of the number of passenger car parking spaces required. You haven't presented an alternative calculation of that.
No, we haven't, no.
And you also agreed that there was demand for both higher cost parking and low cost parking, as demonstrated in the parking demand study.
Well, I think the parking demand study is all-inclusive. It doesn't say what proportion of the additional spaces required would be bought by people wanting the convenience of the higher cost parking, as opposed to those who are looking for low cost parking. And I mean, the evidence, it's stressed time and time again in the parking demand study, in Mr. Melling's proof, in Mr. Witchell's proof, that it's low cost parking that is the important driver. And I query how you're going to fill the multi-storey car parks, which would have to be a higher price.
Well, we went through quite a lot of this last time, so I'm not going to go back over that. I think it's sufficient for our purposes to agree that the Silver Zone extension that is proposed will provide 2,700 low-cost car parking spaces. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes.
And your case is about moving staff car parking, but I don't understand BALPA's position to be that there should be a decrease in the number of car parking spaces available for staff.
I'm sorry, I don't understand where you get that from.
Okay, well, if we take up Mr. Hatton's proof of evidence, at paragraph 13, that's on page 6, just let me know when you're there.
Page 6, paragraph 13.
Yes, that's it. So Mr. Hatton here is explaining that when the Southside staff car park was in operation, so that's before the pandemic arrangements that I understand are in place now, there was insufficient space requiring the airport to open an overflow area. So BALPA's evidence is that it was already insufficient. You wouldn't be proposing that even less staff car parking is provided.
I think the situation there, and you may better ask this question of Mr. Hatton later, is that there was an area adjoining the staff car park which the airport made available for overflow. Now, I also heard that some staff, instead of, when they found that they couldn't find a space in the staff car park, then drove Northside, parked in the long stay, and were permitted to leave when from there as a staff member.
Just to put this in context, what I'm looking at is whether moving staff car parking really does undermine the very special circumstances case for parking in the green belt, and that requires an understanding of the numbers that would be released of spaces. So I just want to identify Balper's evidence is that there's already a shortage of car parking spaces. I'm not concerned with that. I'm just wanting to understand you wouldn't be proposing fewer car parking spaces were the location to be moved.
Well, I think the issue here, it's the staff changeover time. It's not where you have one shift arriving before the previous shift has departed. It's a temporal difficulty.
Mr. Renshaw, I understand it comes from kind of peak time use of the car park, but can I just understand you wouldn't be proposing that fewer car parking spaces were available for staff, would you?
No.
Thank you. And you
So
would...
sorry, just before we move on from that, because obviously I'm interested in the numbers, is the Balper position, we've identified that it's not fewer, is it the same number or is it greater that you're looking for?
We're not advocating a greater number.
So it's the same. Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Nor are you suggesting, I don't think, that there would be any change to the fact that staff parking needs to be self-park.
That's right.
So even if you are correct that 1,400 spaces could be freed up in the silver zone, that's through staff parking moving and block parking in silver zone. I haven't checked those numbers, but we're going to go on the assumption that you're correct with 1,400. The airport would still need 1,000 staff car parking spaces to be provided somewhere.
Yes.
In fact, I think when you were cross-examining Mr. Witchells, you described it as simply a transfer. So that is what would be happening, a transfer of 1,000 spaces from one location to another.
Yes.
Yes. So on that basis, moving the staff car parking would only generate additional 400 spaces, wouldn't it?
Yes.
On the basis you're correct about the block car parking numbers. That's nowhere near enough to negate the need for a silver zone extension, is it?
I think that, as I say, the issue here is that we don't know whether the forecasts will turn out to be correct. There are a lot of issues, but it buys time and avoids the need for the early encroachment on the green belt.
Your proposal would only free up 400 low-cost parking spaces when the parking demand study has demonstrated that 2,700 low-cost parking spaces would be required. That's a very small proportion, isn't it?
Well, the total number is 4,200 you're looking for. And my recollection was that that was the number with the planning application. The update to the parking demand study actually came out with a slightly lower total number of parking spaces required. So I agree with you that what 400 car parking spaces probably amounts to 0.6 of a hectare at a block parked. It's not that it's only making a small contribution, but there may well be other contributions. For example, as I've said, there is interest in off-site park and ride, and even the airport has looked at that. There's the issue of the public transport mode share update, which we don't know how that will work in the future. So we are looking ahead here, but what I'm saying is you could easily find the low-cost space, the first tranche of low-cost spaces that you may need could come from the staff car park.
You don't suggest any other place that car parking could be accommodated in your proof, do you?
Are you referring to low cost?
Yes,
Yeah.
so in addition to, I understand your staff car parking point, but you don't suggest there's any other site that hasn't been looked at or anything like that, do you?
No.
So you haven't actually presented a solution to the provision of low-cost car parking, have you?
We have, we're proposing a contribution, and it seems strange to me that this would seem to be a sort of a win for the airport, in that the requirement for low-cost parking is there, or, you know, I mean, we're in normal times, but the demand for the premium, the multi-storey car park, isn't there at the moment, and we're talking about 2024 for MSCP2, for example, now. But that by moving staff parking into some part of the north side would reduce the availability of parking at higher cost, and thus encourage the development of the multi-storey car park.
But your solution doesn't remove the need for a greenbelt extension to provide low-cost car parking, does it?
No, it doesn't avoid the need, it just reduces the amount that might be required.
You don't dispute any of the overall benefits of the proposed development, do you, in your evidence?
The
expansion.
have not objected in principle to the expansion of the airport.
So you don't, I don't think, provide evidence in relation to any of the other very special circumstances other than the points we've been discussing. That's correct, isn't it?
That's correct, yes.
Thank you. That's all from me then.
Okay, thank you very much. I won't suggest that you re-examine yourself. That could be a little confusing. So if we can move on then, and we'll hear from the, excuse me, from your second witness. You probably need some time to sort yourself out.
I have seen Mr. Hatton, yes. I believe he's on Teams. Yes. Okay, yeah.
Okay, if we could move on then. And I think we've got Mr. Hatton on Teams, if you could join us.
Yeah, good morning.
Hello, Mr. Hatton. If you could drop your camera down slightly, we're getting an image.
I was trying to do that earlier.
Image of only the top part of you. A little unusual. Okay, right. Good morning, Mr. Hatton. If I move straight over then to Mr. Renshaw, because you're acting as the advocate in relation to Mr. Hatton.
Good morning, Mr. Hatton. You are John Hatton, a recently retired airline pilot?
That's correct, yeah.
And you spent 27 years as a commercial pilot after 16 years in the Fleet Air Arm. For how many of your 27 years did you fly from Bristol?
About 18. I started in 2002, retired last year.
So I think you said since 2002?
That's right, yeah.
That's right. And you say you're a custodian trustee for BALPA. Perhaps you could just elaborate on that for the inspector.
It's kind of a supervisory role for the union executive, really. Probably most equivalent to being a non-executive director, but nowhere near as important as that, I would say.
And you confirm that the evidence you gave in your proof is true?
Yeah, it's true. I've noticed one error in my Appendix J since I submitted it, so we can cover that later, but otherwise, yeah, true.
Yeah. Now, your proof of evidence contains important information in relation to the case for which I've just given evidence in chief regarding the failure to consider alternative parking strategy put forward by BALPA, which BALPA says would at the very least reduce the demand to encroach on the Greenbelt for low-cost airport parking. At paragraph 5, you describe the location of staff parking until late 2018. Was that in what is now known as the Greenbelt inset?
Yes, it was.
And where have staff been allocated parking since operations have been reduced during the COVID pandemic?
They've been allocated spaces Northside variously in the multi-storey car park and in an area of the long stay car park adjacent to it at the western end of the inset.
Right. Now, BALPA's case is related to the best use of the current staff car parking location in the Greenbelt, and which was formerly low-cost silver zone passenger parking. Can I ask you to read paragraphs 14 and 15 of your proof?
Yep. 14, attached to Appendix D is a map showing the parking spaces in the main section of the staff car park located in the Greenbelt, and it can be seen that a large area is given over to access aisles. And one access aisle is required for every 2 parking spaces normally around 2.4 by 4.8 metres in size. For obvious reasons, this arrangement is necessary in order that the vehicles in the staff car park can be self-parked. Apart from the arrivals and departure area where passengers deposit and recover their vehicles, the remainder of the silver zone parking is configured for block parking, where cars are valet parked in blocks bumper to bumper, and therefore far less space is required per vehicle than in the staff car parking area.
And you go on to explain the details at paragraph 16 and 17. You say that there could be additional spaces if the staff waiting building and bus turning circle were also removed. Why didn't you add those spaces in?
Well, it's all a bit of an approximation, clearly, but the passenger block parking also requires some space which is not block parking, i.e. for the passengers to drop off and pick up their cars, so that would dilute the block parking capacity. On the other hand, they probably don't need the full 4.8 metres per car when they're block parked, so that would increase the number of cars that they could park. So I felt it better to act on the conservative side and just go for the figures I've put forward, and of course there's been no dispute from BAL on those figures, so that would suggest that they probably are conservative.
Right. Now, you were mindful that there might be a cost issue in terms of the strategy of staff parking on the north side, so you undertook an assessment of parking prices there. Would you read your paragraphs 23 and 24, please?
Yes, this is the cost implications for BAL, comparing parking prices in the Silver Zone and Northside car parks. Our analysis of the airport's parking prices during the summer of 2018 indicates that the price charged for Northside long stay car parking was around about 1.4 times the price charged in the Silver Zone long stay car park, and that's set out in Appendix J. It's been argued above that at least 1.4, that's 40% more cars, could be block parked in the Silver Zone, with the staff car parking area to be reverted to public parking. However, this ratio shows there is no difference in the parking revenue potentially lost to BAL when comparing staff parking in the Northside car park and staff parking in the area that could otherwise be used for Silver Zone block parking. It would appear, therefore, that under the pricing structure in place before the COVID pandemic, there would be no loss of revenue were staff to be parked in the Northside long stay car park, and this ignores the financial cost of running the staff buses, of course. And the reason that we've put forward that argument is that when we discussed matters with the airport, their principal reason for it not being moved Northside was the cost implication.
Now, Appendix J of your proof of evidence, which sets out your findings, is a little bit complicated, so it might be helpful if you ran through this for the benefit of the inspectors?
Yeah, well, it is complicated, and that's principally because it was really a bit of a working document. I've added some explanatory text to try and make it a bit easier to understand. But what we're basically trying to do is...
Can I just say, that to find it, it's page 56 of Mr. Hatton's appendices, just to get you there.
I'm working on hard copy.
But is Appendix J?
I'm on Appendix J.
Yeah.
I haven't got page numbers, or are you looking at PDF?
I'm looking at the PDF, yes.
No,
right,
it's
yeah.
okay.
You're
I'm on Appendix J.
Right, fine.
So the aim here was to look at how the revenue earned per square metre from the block parking in the Silver Zone compares to the revenue earned per square metre in the Northside long stay car park. And as we know, Bristol Airport long stay parking takes two forms: conventional car parks with an arc of 2 rows, and block parking where cars are valet parked bumper to bumper but charged at a lower daily rate. The difference in parking density is around 50% depending on the length of the block parking columns. Obviously, the longer the column, the more efficient parking can be. So really, if you go further down the documents and start looking at the main table, let's say, for example, look at the 5th line down, the week commencing 16th of June 2018. I should just add that all these figures were extracted on the 17th of May by looking at the airport's website for parking pricing. You can look ahead for a whole year on there, and it shows you the prices for every single car park that's available. So I just screenshotted all of those pages and then extracted these figures from those screenshots. And the columns, there's various columns, as I say, it's principally a working document. Probably the most important ones are the first 3. So the first column is the price in the Silver Zone. So looking at the 5th line down, the 16th of June, you can see the price in the Silver Zone for a week, 7 days, was £49. And then if you go to the 3rd column, the price in the long stay car park was £86. Now, if you then look at the actual cost of the airport per metre, you need to multiply the cost in the Silver Zone by 1.4. So that shows that were you to give that area over to block parking and not use it for staff parking, you could generate £68.6 per parking space rather than 49, because you could park more densely. So that particular line, you can still see that there's less revenue earned by turning it over to block parking than leaving it as staff parking. If you go further down, two lines further down to 30th of June, you see the position reverses, and actually the revenue earned from that area would be greater. So totally got those 3 columns at the bottom. You can see that for a year, the total earned per space in the Silver Zone block parking would be 2,478. 3rd column, it would be 3,523 if in the long stay car park. But if you turned over the Silver Zone from staff to block parking, i.e. the middle column, you could earn £3,519 for the year. So you'd only lose £4 per year per space if you change the Silver Zone's staff parking area to block parking area. I then worked on the assumption that we'd only move the airline staff over to the north side. So that's why it says the next line down looks at 400 spaces, but you could turn it over to 1,000 spaces. So I've just done a calculation since I produced the spreadsheet, which shows the situation where all of the 1,000 purported staff spaces to be turned over to block parking, and the equivalent numbers are in the 2nd column, where we've got 3,519 per space for a year. If you looked at 1,000 spaces, that's 3,519,060, and the next column along it would be 3,523,000. So it's about £4,000 difference were you to effectively move all the staff car parking from the Silver Zone to the north side. The loss of revenue to the airport would be in the region of £4,000. Is there anything else you need?
Thank you. So there is you said you were going to point out an error in that table, and I think it must be in the figures at the end of the row, the end of the row which starts 400 spaces.
Yes, that's right. Sorry, the final two columns are the columns labelled LS minus SZ and LS minus SZ bracket staff, those final two columns. The 400 spaces line should be the line above. Now, for one space multiplied by 400, in actual fact, those two numbers, 209,000 and 788, are only 200 times the figure above, so they should be doubled. So that should be 418,000 instead of 209, and it should be 1,576 instead of 788.
And then if you gross up the numbers to 1,000 spaces, you say the 1,576 difference is in fact just under £4,000, which I calculate to be 3,940.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah.
Right. What is your understanding of the occupancy of the long stay car parking area Northside? Are there some areas less full than others? And I'm talking here not about how things are today, because they're very different, but pre-COVID. How was the long stay car parking area generally occupied? Were there some areas that were more in demand than others?
Yeah, I undertook several inspections of the long stay car park while we were still part Northside, and generally speaking, the area of the long stay car park furthest from the terminal was the least occupied, which is not surprising. So although there is a bus service within the long stay park up to pick up passengers from the furthest extent, obviously most people don't want to wait for a bus, so they'll park closest to the terminal, which means that the very western end of the very eastern end of the long stay car park, adjacent to the airport entrance, that was under-occupied, so it's generally speaking of several hundred spaces vacant just there.
Now, the planning application before the inspectors involves significant change to the ground level parking layout Northside due to new multi-storey car park developments, the entrance gyratory, and other rearrangement of parking provision. Do you see any issues with passengers parking in the long stay area during such alterations?
I imagine there'll be quite a lot of inconvenience and delay to passengers.
Mm-hmm. And you've read the parking demand study and seen the emphasis on the demand for low-cost parking. Do you consider the same situation will apply after construction of multi-storey car park 2 in terms of the airport needing to encourage its use through a pricing policy?
Well, yeah, clearly, the airport themselves admit, and as you've pointed out, have stated several times, that the demand is for low cost, not for higher cost parking, as you find Northside. So there's any argument that there'll be any extra demand for premium, if you like, premium parking. The demand is going to be in the silver zone to the south.
How do you think that moving staff parking Northside might help in terms of demand for the multi-storey car park spaces?
Well, for a start off, obviously if we take 1,000 spaces out of the south side, that will create 1,400 additional low-cost parking spaces, which is, I don't think that the lady you were talking to earlier quite appreciated that. She was talking in terms of only extra 400 net. But actually, of course, it's 1,400 low-cost parking spaces, which would be created south side, halving the requirement for extra development to the green belt. So that's one point. You move those 1,000 staff north side, and as you said, they will have to be put somewhere, which would displace possibly some passengers who would have otherwise parked in one part of the north side and require them to park elsewhere on the north side, which that in itself would increase demand, if you like, north side.
Thank you, Mr. Hatton.
Okay, thank you very much. Ms Noble.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, Mr. Hatton.
Morning.
At paragraph 1, you tell us that you're a former airline captain and an elected representative of BALPA. So no doubt you have great knowledge and experience with the aviation industry. But to be fair to you, you don't claim to have any expertise in planning. That's correct, isn't it?
Well, if I had, then obviously I would have written it down in my opening statement. Yeah.
Mr. Hatton, I asked Mr. Renshaw a number of questions during the Highways Week on his evidence and also your evidence, including your appendices where you dealt with the spare capacity in the Northside multi-storey and issues to do with staff travel. I understand it that you wouldn't contradict the answers he gave to those questions, would you?
No.
Thank you. And you're not providing evidence in relation to Greenbelt policy or the application of that to this development, are you?
No.
Thank you. Well, absolutely no disrespect meant, but I won't ask you any further questions just because I've put the questions I need to Mr. Renshaw. Thank you.
That's fine, thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. I presume no re-examination? No. Okay.
I don't know if there's anything to re-examine on. Thank you.
Indeed. Okay, thanks very much for your time, Mr. Hatton, and indeed
Thank
Mr.
you.
Renshaw. Just while we're rearranging ourselves in the room, let's take a break slightly earlier. We'll resume, please, at 10:02, and at that point, I'm looking at the screen. Yes, we'll hear from Ms. Sutherland, who I know is on screen. So 10:02, please. Right, it's 10:02. We can resume. Ms. Sutherland. Hello there. Good morning.
Good morning, sir.
Okay, over to you for your evidence in chief. I've obviously got your evidence, and I think it was about how many appendices? Sorry, about 5 appendices. 4 appendices to your original proof, and then your additional evidence in relation to the provision of OACP in July. So over to you. I think you're estimating about an hour, and then obviously cross-examination. Okay.
Yes. Thank you very much, sir. As the inspectors will be aware, my challenge to this application is based on several aspects, but key is the lack of consideration of park and ride to serve the future demand for parking from the airport. In discussing highways matters last week, it was clear that BAL have not analysed any parking other than on their site when submitting this application. Mr. Witchell gave clear evidence in relation to the fact that the airport are unable to or are unwilling to assess off-airport car parking and have made no distinction between off-airport car parking that is lawfully delivered and that which is not. And they've also, sir, included references to other unlawful parking issues surrounding the airport into one large amalgamated reference to unofficial car parking, by which BAL mean anything not on our site. In failing to do this, and having had months to do so, BAL have not updated their ASAS nor their master plan since changes to Greenbelt policy in 2012 with the MPPF's introduction. The 2011 application was based on different policy constraints, yet is constantly referred to as if it's acceptable to continue to nibble away at the Greenbelt when, in actual fact, Greenbelt policy is much more restrictive. Despite a major application not in accordance with Greenbelt policy, the airport have taken a rather slack approach, preferring to suggest that an ASAS is only necessary if consent is granted for this scheme, when they've already accepted in evidence an up-to-date ASAS should always be in place. Further, they have only just started consulting on an update to the master plan for the airport. It seems to me, sir, this is the wrong way round. If the airport seek to expand, they need to have carried out this work prior to having made the application. In terms of Greenbelt, my proof sets out the main points that I make, and these 2 points are key. Firstly, that there is an available alternative site in terms of sequential testing, my site and others, that there are no very special circumstances to allow consideration of the benefits to outweigh the established harm to the Greenbelt from the inappropriate development proposed. And here, sir, I'm particularly referring to Cog Loop 1, seasonal restrictions, and Cog Loop 2, the expansion onto Virgin Greenbelt. If I take you, sir, to para 19 of my proof of evidence, I set out here specifically that applications in the Greenbelt must pass a sequential test. The sequential test is required to explore all other options and sites for the same use. And if no other sites are viable or available, then the site can pass the sequential test. The sequential test approach used by BAL is set out in Chapter 5 of the Parking Strategy, under the heading Review of Potential Car Parking Locations, and we agree with the overarching approach adopted by BAL that they should firstly consider sites within the Greenbelt inset, then move on to strategic park and ride locations remote from the airport, before looking at sites outside the Greenbelt inset and sites contiguous in the Greenbelt. So, sir, prior to looking at Cog Loop 1 and Cog Loop 2, The airport needed to look at sites within the Greenbelt inset. That's a matter that you've just heard submissions on from BALPA and the availability of additional parking spaces there. And then they had to look at strategic park and ride locations. I'll come on in a moment to look in more detail at how BAL have carried out this assessment and why I consider it inadequate for these purposes. But for the moment, I'm going to move on to the very special circumstances argument. There is no doubt that there is a need and demand for additional parking, although I do take specific issue with the reference in Mr. Melling's proof. If I draw your attention, sir, to Mr. Melling's proof, page 33, para 4.3. This is the beginning of the airport's argument on very special circumstances. And so you'll see that point 1 that they make is the need for additional car parking in the green belt. Sir, there is no need for additional parking in the green belt. There is a need and a demand for additional parking to serve the airport. In terms of need, the headline figure that the airport have relied upon is a need by 2030 for 30,000 spaces, of which BAL proposed to deliver 22,500. Even allowing for mode share improvements, there is a significant demand and a significant under provision. This is where reference to the 8,000 spaces in my original proof is relevant. Yesterday, we heard in discussion that BAL consider under provision will increase off-airport car parking. And there were a whole series of questions put to Mr. Gertler in this respect. Clearly, sir, the airport cannot on one hand state that in having an increased demand, there will be an increased demand for off-airport car parking, and yet at the same time claim that that increased demand for off-airport car parking will be reduced by implementing low-cost parking as a provision. Even accepting BAL figures, much like Mr. Humphreys did yesterday in relation to his discussions with Mr. Gertler, if we accept that position, BAL identify 2,700 additional spaces on Cog Loop 1 and 2 in the green belt. In terms of alternative sites, if we turn to the next section of Mr. Melling's proof at 4.4,
Sorry, Ms. Sutherland, is this in the rebuttal?
I didn't provide a rebuttal, Miss Noble.
No, sorry, Mr. Melling's
Mr.
rebuttal.
Mellings.
Oh yes, I'm so sorry. Yes, in Mr. Melling's rebuttal rather than his POE. Are you all there?
Yeah. Yep,
It's on
I think
page 42, para 4.4.
Yeah, we are.
And Mr. Melling goes on to talk about there's no further suitable and available sites for car parking outside of the green belt. Mr. Melling there mentions the fact that I have raised a concern in relation to DM30, and sir, I'm aware that that's not an issue that you want me to address you on in relation to this scheme. However, I do continue to say, and Mr. Melling has not addressed, that there are alternative sites and that the continuation of the airport's approach does lead to a monopoly in relation to airport car parking. If we can go, sir, to the appendices to Mr. Melling's rebuttal, this is relation to the letter from Womble Bond Dickinson on the competition law implications. I don't want to go over old ground, and Mr. Gertle was asked questions about this yesterday. But, sir, the point that I would like to make absolutely clear is that of paragraph 4. In this paragraph, BAL are, or sorry, their legal advisors are asserting that it would be anti-competitive if the council were to require the airport to deliver both MSCP and or low-cost parking at specific rates. We absolutely agree with that. That is not, however, the point that was being made. It is nothing to do with the rates at which parking is charged, but the fact that the airport seek to prevent all other airport parking operators in relation to the airport demand. That does bring us back into the area of competition law. And so if we go to my appendices 4B, this was the document headed ED12, explanatory note on off-airport car parking. On page 4 of that document, so at the very top, at para 48.2, this was taken from the North Somerset Replacement Local Plan Inspector's Report in 2006. So this was the situation at the time where the council were considering whether other ways of meeting airport parking demand could be appropriate. And within the replacement local plan, there had initially been concerns about the monopoly situation raised and questions about how a policy such as what subsequently has emerged to become DM30 could work. So the point it says there is clearly a policy that would have the effect of interfering with the operation of the free market cannot be lightly countenanced. But it seems to me that the proposed supporting text gives very good reasons for seeking to concentrate parking on the airport, we can read there, namely to further the airport surface access strategy and to minimise harm to the visual amenities of the Greenbelt. Well, sir, as we're looking at alternative sites that are not in the Greenbelt, we don't have to think about the visual amenities aspect, which leaves us purely with the point that BAL have made, by Mr. Melling's proof and by Mr. Litchell's proof, that any off-airport car parking could have an impact on the ASAS. Again, sir, I don't want to take us too much back into the highways situation, but that was to demonstrate that previous inspectors, in considering core strategy and the way in which the allocation of parking demand for the airport should be managed, was to prevent airport parking off-site in the Greenbelt and is not relevant to a determination on sites out with the Greenbelt, as per the sequential testing. It's my view that in those circumstances and in accordance with that inspector's determination, it would be granting a monopoly to an airport if they were to be granted consent without consideration of off-airport car parking and without consideration of appropriate alternative sites. That brings me back, sir, to looking at alternative sites. The inspectors are aware that there have been 2 proposals put forward in relation to off-airport car parking provision. One by Mr. Mead, close to junction 21, and one by Mr. Pearce that you've got the full details of here. And sir, the airport, in carrying out their sequential testing, did consider the Mead scheme, and I'd like us to go please to where the airport have considered the Mead scheme. And that is, sorry, I'm trying to find my reference. This is again in the Mr. Melling proof of evidence, rebuttal proof of evidence. At para I'm sorry, sir. I'm going to have to come back to that point. I've lost the correct reference for it in relation.
Fine. I mean, take your time to find it now if it helps your flow rather than coming back.
Thank you, sir. I'm so sorry.
No, it happens. Don't worry.
Yes, sir. I'm so sorry. Thank you very much for giving me that additional time to find it. It does help if I've got the right references for you. So, sir, going back to my proof of evidence at para 25.
Yep.
And you can see there that I've looked at the way in which BAL assessed the long list and then the short list. And so at para 25, you will see the assessment of the shortlisted sites was contained within table 5.4. And I've picked out the relevant comment in relation to the Mead site. This is the only comment made. And as you can see, sir, the only issue raised is that there is possibly a limited catchment area as the site is located near to Weston-super-Mare. That is the only criticism of the Mead site by the airport in relation to establishing that that site is not reasonably available. So BAL's own evidence has demonstrated that the major growth of the airport customer base that need this airport car parking is from the southwest corridor, such that this statement has absolutely no meaning whatsoever. This is where the majority of the growth in passenger demand is going to be coming from. They're going to come up the M5, come off at junction 22 or junction 21, and this particular site at junction 21 was very conveniently located there. And so I'd also make the point that that particular application was not refused, it was withdrawn by the applicant. And I acted for that applicant, and there were sound commercial reasons that he had to withdraw that application at that time. There is nothing to say that that site could not come forward. And indeed, BAL have never contacted that site owner, nor given any further information in their argument here on sequential testing as to why it could not come forward. So in relation to sequential testing, it's not just my alternative sites, sir. Obviously, there are a whole range of other alternative sites that the airport have failed to properly assess. If we move on to my paragraph 26, you will see that the airport lists there, because it's an excerpt from their findings, the reasons why they consider Park and Ride could not come forward. And they finish at the bottom of my para 26 as saying, as there are presently no realistic off-site Park and Ride sites, these options have not been taken forward as part of the preferred car parking solution. So that's not in accordance with Greenbelt sequential testing. Sequential testing does not require there to be an existing car park as an alternative site. It requires that there are sites available where that car park could be delivered. The reasons at my para 27 for discounting off-site are therefore captured entirely in these 6 points set out here. Limited catchment area, we've just discussed that. Distance from the airport. I'm not sure that distance from the airport is a matter that would have any impact whatsoever on the availability of an alternative site. And with the airport being situated in the middle of the Greenbelt in an isolated location, sites outside of the Greenbelt are by necessity going to have to be provided at some distance. That doesn't prevent them from providing an adequate service, nor for that service to be desirable. And in fact, other off-airport car parking provision is in other areas outside of the Greenbelt and not assessed by the airport for these purposes, considerably further away and yet still successfully, financially and viably run. The next point, the rural nature of the transport network, rather supports my position other than that of BAL, in that what the proposal for alternative sites would bring is vehicles parking out with the Greenbelt, close to the major road network, and using buses to travel to the airport along the rural transport network. This is one of the great benefits of the scheme of Park and Ride. It's not a reason to discount it. The next point, high land prices. I'm sorry, sir, but that is not a reasonable nor viable position to take in relation to discounting the potential for off-site airport parking. As we know and we've heard already under cross-examination, the airport have not provided any viability assessments setting out why costings of airport parking cannot be delivered at the rates that would make them appropriate. We've also heard in relation to Greenbelt policy, the requirement to share the benefits. If the airport's going to expand and it's going to have an increased income base, why should it not be required to pay for sites elsewhere that properly meet planning policy? Or, sir, why should they not go into some form of agreement with those parking operators? Other airports commonly use parking sites not under their control and ownership in order to meet their parking demand. This clearly demonstrates that BAL are simply not considering these options appropriately. They then go on, quite bizarrely, to say there's a potential need for remediation. I can only imagine, sir, that what they're saying here is that some sites outside of the Greenbelt that may come forward, being brownfield sites, may have an element of remediation. Again, sir, that's a planning policy matter in relation to the delivery of those sites, is not linked to any of the options that they have considered, and doesn't in any way take away the potential for those sites to come forward for parking provision. Finally, sir, in relation to this point, the airport say that off-site car parking should be discounted because it will only be able to be delivered as self-parking. So that's quite clearly wrong. Both the Mead application and the current Pierce application provided for block parking in accordance with the Silver Zone and the operation of exactly the same service as that of the Silver Zone. Passengers parking, being taken to the rear to block parking, getting onto buses and going to the airport terminal. Mr. Whitchell agreed that that service was exactly the same. So, sir, looking at those reasons why the airport considered off-airport car parking was not deliverable demonstrates clearly that they failed to adequately consider it, and in fact were quite biased in their approach to the sequential testing process, bringing in matters that were not relevant. BAL had got to look at whether their proposed development for 2,700 car parking spaces could be located at an alternative site. Their assumptions, such as self-parking, despite being aware that most off-airport car parking operators use block parking, demonstrates a failure entirely to meet sequential testing requirements. The simple reason, sir, is that BAL do not want to lose parking revenue and have repeatedly stated that they wish to remove all competition. Throughout all of the documents that we've seen, throughout Mr. Melling's proof, and in particular in relation to off-airport car parking provision, there has been a consistent misrepresentation that all off-airport car parking is delivered unlawfully. Mr. Whitchell accepted that the use of permitted development rights to deliver airport car parking on airport is the same use of permitted development rights to deliver off airport car parking. Both are delivering car parking under permitted development rights in the green belt. However, sir, because the airport have not carried out any assessment of off-airport car parking, they simply refer to the fact that it is a nuisance, that it has adverse impacts on the community. They don't give any evidence whatsoever for that, because they have lumped together off-airport car parking with other inappropriate parking in side streets by taxi drivers and all the other matters that you heard from the local community in relation to. The airport have put it all together in order to undermine competitiveness. They do not want competitors there. And the whole stated aim of their application has been to deliver low-cost parking in order to prevent OACP and meet demand. They accept that demand is there, but they consider that if they were to deliver that demand, there would be a reduction in OACP. So I've already mentioned at the beginning of my submission that that is not credible. There's no assessment of the sector that supports that contention. And the contention that delivering COG 1 or COG 2 will have any effect whatsoever on off-airport car parking is completely refuted. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. In fact, quite the opposite. There's no evidence whatsoever to suggest that even if they do deliver COG 1 and COG 2, airport car parking would cease off-airport. They have accepted themselves that numbers are growing and that several of the packages of measures that they have promoted in order to reduce OACP have been ongoing for many years without any success whatsoever. BAL refer to this package of measures to mitigate the development in the Greenbelt, but Whitchell accepted there's no evidence of these measures having worked in the past. It's easy to see, sir, why some people consider that the payment of Section 106 monies for an enforcement officer to the council could be wrongly considered, I add, sir, but this is a public perception, as bribing the council to allow the consent. Returning to very special circumstances, the first point that BAL make at 4.3 is that there is a demand for parking. We've discussed that. We agree there's a demand. The second point that they make is that that demand cannot be delivered elsewhere, and so we've just discussed that in detail. The third very special circumstances that BA plead is a need for growth of the airport. This airport has been growing since it first started operating. Whilst I appreciate that many of the parties involved today seek to prevent the continued expansion of the airport full stop, we have not taken that position. We have accepted that BAL have continued to grow over an extended period of time, and that they will continue to grow as far back as 2006, when the replacement local plan was being brought through. It was talked about that by 2030, the airport would have moved to 12 MPPA. It's no surprise that this application has come forward, and it will be no surprise that in due course, further applications to expand will come forward. It is not, however, very special circumstances simply to say that you would like your business to grow. Airports forecasting growth, which cannot deliver that growth on site, do not constitute very special circumstances that outweigh inappropriate development. They may well be a matter in the planning balance, but they are not very special circumstances. I recognise economic benefit argument made under this third heading. The airport is saying we bring all manner of economic benefits, and for that reason, it's very special circumstances for us to park in the green belt. But again, sir, that's not a factor in the VSC part of this appeal. It's a matter for the planning balance for the inspectors. And again, there's no evidence before the inquiry that parking under the control of BAL is subject to any viability assessment. We've already heard it's up to them, and in fact would be anti-competitive if anybody imposed parking charges at specific areas of the site. The council are only able to require the airport to deliver parking out with the greenbelt and within the greenbelt inset by way of phasing conditions. And so to date, the airport have not complied with previous phasing agreements made. In 2011, when they predicted growth to 10 MPPA, they proposed to deliver MSCP2. They subsequently delayed that delivery in favour of further purported low-cost car parking, surfaced car parking, because, and I refer you back to the decision documents there, but it was quite clear that the only justification at that point was the airport's consideration of the need for low-cost car parking and the council's support for the idea that low-cost car parking would prevent or lessen off-airport car parking. So that's simply not the case. I also like to make a point in relation to Mr. Gertler's evidence yesterday. BAL's cross-examination on whether the cars can be seen from the various viewpoints showing the current cog loop 1 with cog loop 2 in the background was clearly spurious. There is many references to comparator decisions made. Mr. Melling lists them at his 4.4.3 in his rebuttal. And he goes on in detail If you look, sir, at the bottom of that, I think it's page 43, at the bottom of that page, you can see there references to a whole range of appeal decisions in relation to off-airport car parking appeals. All of those decisions were made in respect of unlawful airport car parking, where people had exceeded the 28-day, now 56-day, permitted development rights. All of those cases were unlawful. But in all of those cases, the inspectors concluded that the use of greenbelt land for block car parking has a significant adverse impact on the openness of the greenbelt. It's simply not true nor appropriate for BAL to attempt to say that because these sites are not readily viewed by the public, they don't have such an impact. Their own evidence demonstrates repeated decisions by the inspectorate that this form of parking in the greenbelt is completely unacceptable. I've reviewed those appeal decisions and I don't expect that you have, sir, because there's an awful lot of reading to do in any case. But in all of those appeal decisions, it's quite clear that operators saying they employed 2, 10, 20 people and provided a boost to the rural economy was not considered anywhere near very special circumstances to outweigh the significant impact of those proposals. And so most of them were in terms of enforcement notice appeals. So they were all in relation to unlawful airport car parking. There are no decisions put forward by the airport in relation to lawful off-airport car parking, of which there is much. I now turn to some further specifics from my proof, and in particular, the alternative site details. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here. You've read my proof and I'm sure the other parties have as well. But the point is that the alternative site that I'm promoting is out with the greenbelt. Although it is partially in open countryside, the majority of it is designated as brownfield land. So it is an area of land appropriate for redevelopment purposes. And it meets all of the criteria in relation to being an appropriate alternative in the sequential testing process, as did Mr. Mead's site. So moving on to probably my final report, point, and that is that we're hearing an awful lot about the monitor and manage approach that the airport would like to bring forward in relation to managing greenbelt car parking. The airport profess to want to prevent off-airport car parking, get rid of the competition. Understandable, they're a business. I'm not sure how that is going to work when the monitor and manage approach they put forward is entirely within their control. You're asking one business to say, sorry, we found out that other businesses could do this better than us and take our profit away, so we'll stop doing it now. It's just not reasonable to consider that the airport would behave in this way. And it certainly isn't backed up by their previous practices in this area. One of the points that came out of the Highways England SOC, oh sorry, not now, what are they now? National Highways, Sorry, but sir, the SOCG that was put forward a couple of weeks ago, I know that we're still waiting to hear from them in due course. But one part of that document specifically said, in relation to monitor and manage, that in reviewing the annual demand, in order to bring forward appropriate movements to meet the requirement for minimising the impact on the Greenbelt, there would need to be the inclusion of off-airport car parking within the surveys and information provided. Given that Highways England consider that in order to adequately monitor and manage, the airport need to include this, and they have not done so to date, any proposal to monitor and manage made currently is not going to meet its stated aim, nor is it going to achieve anything like the understanding of the range of parking opportunities to serve the airport that are not in the Greenbelt. I have no confidence, given the approach to sequential testing, that the airport would consider alternative sites in the future. It is not in their interest to do so. During that cross-examination yesterday, Mr. Humphreys put it to Mr. Gertle that at some point in the future, I believe he said, in 6 years' time, what would happen under monitor and manage if a park and ride came forward? And I believe the answer was that park and ride would take precedence if it was outside of the Greenbelt. How is that going to be delivered, sir, when it's the airport in charge of that monitor and manage process? And that brings me on to my final point, and that's in relation to the ASAS. You already know my views in the fact that the ASAS is considerably out of date, and that any application of this sort for a substantial expansion should have prepared an up-to-date ASAS before even being submitted. And when it became quite clear, following the refusal, that it was a necessary document, it should have been done prior to the inquiry, and it has not been done. One of the concerns in relation to the ASAS is the continuous referral, so I'll take you back again to Mr. Melling's rebuttal proof at 4.4.3. And if you see there, the second sentence says, I would argue that unless linked to the ASAS, there's a real risk that any off-air park provision will impact on public transport services. And he refers to the fact that other inspectors have made this point, and that is in fact the case. In many of those appeal decisions referred to by Mr. Melling, inspectors concluded that those unlawful car parks were not delivering a sustainable service in accordance with the principles of the ASAS. When we look back at 2006, the excerpt I took you to earlier on in my submission from the inspector on the replacement local plan, it is clear again that there is concerns that the ASAS must look at alternative provision and consider it fully. Yet the airport have not done so. There is only one in principle objection to the alternative sites, both Mead and the site I'm currently promoting. That in principle objection is policy DM30, that the only way in which car parking, whether in the Greenbelt or not, can be provided is in association with hotel accommodation. That is the only policy that allows for parking other than on the airport site. It is incredibly restrictive, and it does not reflect the demand that the airport have got to deliver parking for the services. But if we leave that ASAS to some point in the future, in 6 months' time, in 12 months' time, none of the third parties here will have input to it. None of these points will be made. It will be left to the airport and the officers at the council who supported this scheme to determine what is appropriate. Unless the ASAS is properly drafted to include appropriate consideration of all options, and that includes, sir, reference to JLTP4, which, as we discussed under the parking and transport heading, sets out clearly that park and ride to serve the airport should be a future consideration. None of this is currently covered in any of the documents I've seen for this appeal. So to summarise, in my view, there is a reasonably alternative site available, if not two or more that have not been assessed. Secondly, that there are no very special circumstances shown by the pleadings by BAL. And thirdly, that saying you want to grow your business is not sufficient justification for very special circumstances. In terms of impact, Greenbelt block parking has significant adverse impact on openness. There is no question of that. Mitigation being proposed is insufficient. Finally, sir, there was one point that was put to Mr. Renshaw earlier this morning in relation to the fact that his proposals can only deal with 400 spaces when BAL needs 2,700. The first point on that, sir, is, of course, the alternative parking provision put forward by both Mead and Pearce was for 3,000 spaces in order to meet the identified demand at that point by the airport. And the second point, sir, is that case law establishes quite clearly that you can disaggregate under sequential testing. So it may well be that BALPA's considerations only deliver a further 400 parking spaces before the airport go to Greenbelt parking. But those 400 are part of the 2,700 needed. And that growth is over an extended period of time to 2030. Other solutions may well come forward in that time. And under Tesco stores, it's quite acceptable for BAL to consider where those parking spaces are coming from a range of sites, provided that they meet sustainability. And that's my very last point, sir. When we were dealing with transport, there were issues in relation to the data from the CAA and the data from the airport in relation to mode share. The airport considered that there was a 12.5% mode share. They wanted to move to 15. I know things have moved and there's been lots of discussion about all of this, but the CAA data said 21%. And under cross-examination, Mr. Witchell accepted that they were unclear how this discrepancy arose. But he also accepted that the CAA figures include buses coming from off-airport car parking as buses for the purpose of mode share assessment. So rather than in any way damaging the mode share of the airport, which is the point that they're saying without compliance with ASAS and the requirements to assist with mode share, in actual fact, off-airport car parking, using buses to the airport and preventing the use of the rural highway network is a substantial contribution to the ASAS that's gone completely unrecognised throughout these proceedings. And I'll leave it there, sir. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much indeed for that. Ms. Noble.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, Ms. Sutherland.
Good morning.
You've given evidence before during the Highways Week, so as with Mr. Renshaw, I'll try not to go over the same ground that we covered then. You make two main points in your proof of evidence that are relevant to Greenbelt issues, and these are, as I understand it, that the parking strategy is flawed, and we'll look at that. And secondly, that your client's site, Heathfield Park, is a more appropriate site for park and ride. You don't go into any green belt assessment, and by that I mean there's nowhere in your evidence an analysis of the contribution of the land to greenbelt purposes or the impact on openness in physical and visual terms or anything like that. That's right, isn't it?
I've not prepared any evidence of that sort myself, but obviously I'm aware of the Greenbelt assessment carried out by the local planning authority in April. And as I just said in my evidence in chief, I am aware of all of the airport parking appeal decisions and the fact that in all those cases, the inspector found that block parking had a significant impact on the openness of the Greenbelt. So I'm not relying on my own opinion in this respect. I'm relying on previous decisions.
Okay. So if we could look at the first of those 2 points then, and that's the parking strategy. So if we take that up, it's CD 2.12.
Sorry, I've got the proofs of evidence open, but bear with me while I find the CD.
No problem.
.12. Yes, I have it.
I'm going to look through this in some detail just to understand precisely where the dispute lies in relation to this strategy. So if we look first at PDF and actual page 27, section 5 is called the review of potential car parking locations.
Yes.
Section 5.2, we have the overarching approach.
Yes.
I understand from what you said in your examination in chief that you don't disagree with this overarching approach.
Absolutely not.
At paragraph 5.2.2 of that document, it identifies that the aim of the sequential approach is to ensure that all potential development options are appraised before moving on to the next area of search in the sequence. There's no dispute with that as an aim, is there?
No, not at all. That is just a recital of how the sequential approach works. Where we differ is that I don't consider that BAL did then carry that search out properly.
Yes, so if we could turn then to PDF page 29. So
yes.
Section 5.4, this is the second option in that sequence that we just agreed was appropriate, and this is strategic park and ride locations. And here, BAL have adopted a two-step process. First, to identify a long list of sites, and then a more detailed review of the strengths and weaknesses to identify a short list of sites. You wouldn't disagree with that approach, would you?
No, not at all.
If If we turn to PDF page 30, just over the page, table 5.2, we have a list of the criteria used to assess off-site sites.
Yes.
These characteristics listed here are the characteristics that you argue the Heathfield site has. That's right, isn't it?
No, these are the characteristics that you have set, that BAL have set out that they carried out their off-site assessment on. I actually disagree with it. So in particular, the criterion and the description. So if we look at this in some detail, the size of the site, the area of the site, I just mentioned in my evidence in chief. Again, that can be disaggregated, but clearly in order to be a viable operation, it's got to be a decent sized site, hence the 2,700, 3,000 spaces. The next thing is the number of spaces where cars are self-parked. There's no explanation whatsoever why that, in brackets, self-parking is put there. It's not my experience of off-airport car parking. It's not the inspectorate's experience of off-airport car parking. So no, I don't think that's an appropriate criteria. Under transport, distance to highways and roads. Again, I don't think distance from the airport is a relevant criteria, but distance to public transport certainly is, and public transport frequency certainly is, accessibility certainly is, demand and catchment certainly is. I'm not sure what likelihood of use means. That's very much a questionable criteria. That's making assumptions and judgments that have no basis in any evidence. And then journey time reliability, absolutely, I think that is essential for customers to feel that they are being given a decent level of service, but I don't think that that's a high criterion in the scoring matrix. And then under the planning and environmental constraints, whether it's in Greenbelt, the level of visual impact, whether the site's at risk of flooding, planning constraints, loss of amenity, absolutely relevant. So yeah, there are some points in there that I think are completely wrong, but most of it's okay.
So we can agree at least that most of the criteria are sensible and appropriate to apply.
Most of them, but as I say, I've pointed out the ones that are not. So as a whole, the criteria is flawed because it doesn't have appropriate consideration of relevant points.
But these are the criteria that you have addressed in your evidence in relation to your alternative site.
No, I haven't.
Where you've discussed how many cars can be parked, the size of the site, the distance. You've discussed these criteria in your evidence.
Yes, I have. But I didn't do it against your criteria. I did it on the basis of the Greenbelt sequential testing assessment process.
Yeah, so the inspector
wouldn't use your criteria because I disagree with the content of your criteria.
Okay, well, that's helpful. The inspector can note that where you give evidence in relation to the alternative site, you think that evidence is relevant to the appropriateness of the site. So where that overlaps with these criteria, we're agreed that they're sensible criteria.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, of course. So in relation to, accessibility, demand and catchment, Greenbelt, visual impact, etc. Of course, those are all absolutely standard planning matters.
So at the bottom of page 30, we have shortlisting, and it explains there that an initial sift was done. BAL determined certain locations could not be progressed further for various reasons.
Yeah.
Fine. We're just having a look at what was done. If we turn to page 31, we have a rather...
Well, hang on a minute. Sorry, you were just asking me to look at that section. And of course, in that section, I'll just bring to the inspector's attention that at table 5.3, it shows the Mead group proposal and gives it a green tick, but it doesn't say anything about the Pearce proposal.
Yes. the Heathfield Park site was not considered in the parking strategy, but there is an assessment of it in Mr. Melling's evidence, and we will come to that, I promise. We're just looking at...
But that's one of the reasons you were asking me to explain why I disagree with the parking strategy, and that's one of the reasons, is that you utterly failed in your first sweep to identify the Heathfield Park site, yet it came forward.
Well, Mr. Melling is going to be giving evidence in relation to Greenbelt and in relation to planning, so we can pick this up with him as to why certain sites were and weren't included here. But just in terms of leaving aside the point about Heathfield Park, which we'll come to, I'm just trying to identify what else, if anything, there is in relation to this that you don't agree with. So just quickly, on page 31, we have table 5.3, and this is an assessment of long list sites against that selection criteria. So each site thoroughly assessed against those criteria, and there's a kind of traffic light system for whether they are suitable for a park and ride off-site. That's what this does, isn't it?
That's what your document says, yes.
Yeah. And then on to the next page, just briefly, page 32, table 5.4, we have an assessment of shortlisted sites, and here is a summary of the site, the description, the strengths, and the weaknesses.
That's correct. I disagree with them. So if you'd like me to point out why I disagree with them for the purposes of this exercise, I'm quite happy to do so.
Nowhere in your evidence have you carried out a comprehensive assessment of the sites available like there is in this document, have you?
I've carried out that assessment, but I have not put it into evidence. What I can do, though, is explain to you why. You said you wanted to know why I disagree with you. So in relation to this, I think the key point would be made that the majority of these comments are site may be too expensive, high capital costs, might only cater for passengers from Western, site may be expensive. So actually, the points that I made in my evidence in chief in relation to the way in which this sequential testing search was carried out quite clearly set out that inappropriate factors were considered. Basically, if you didn't own the site and it was going to cost you money, you weren't prepared to do it.
Nowhere in your evidence that's before the inspector have you carried out an assessment, a comprehensive assessment like this, long list, short list, against criteria that the inspectors can look at?
I am not required to set out evidence of that sort. That is the job of the airport as part of their sequential testing. But what I have done is given evidence in relation to my consideration and my opinion that none of these factors are correct, that they have taken into consideration matters that are not relevant for sequential testing, such as cost.
Well, the inspectors will be able to form their view, but what we do have here is, I would say, an extensive assessment, and the inspectors have heard your criticisms. You haven't put forward a comprehensive assessment, so the inspectors can determine how much weight to give to this. Yeah.
Absolutely, that is the case in all these matters. They have to consider whether the evidence I've given or the evidence Bal has given is appropriate or more likely to be correct. So I don't see any difference there.
So the second point that you raise in your proof of evidence that's relevant to Greenbelt matters is in relation to the appropriateness of the Heathfield Park proposal. Now, you're quite right that...
Sorry, sorry to interrupt you, Ms Noble, but at the beginning of your cross-examination, you characterised the fact that I'd only mentioned 2 points in Greenbelt, and I did not agree with that characterisation because you didn't give me an opportunity to. So, in actual fact, I mentioned several issues in relation to my concerns about the Greenbelt, and one of them was the fact that the alternative parking sequential test had not been carried out well and was incorrect. And the second one was that there were no very special circumstances. Not, as you say, a second point that I have an alternative site. But if you want to talk about the alternative site, then I'm quite happy to do so. But I'm just making the point, I don't want you to miss anything, because I was quite clear that it was very special circumstances was my main second point.
Your first point related to the carrying out of the sequential test as it's set out in the parking strategy, and we've gone through that just so that the inspector can understand where we disagree.
Yes.
On the basis of your proof of evidence, the other point, as I understood it, related to the Heathfield Park proposal. I'm not going into any matters to do with ASAS and things that we discussed last week. That's why I said we were dealing with those two matters.
No, but I was dealing with the very special circumstances argument in the Greenbelt as well, Miss Noble. I made that quite clear in my proof and in my evidence in chief.
As you'll understand, both the availability of sites and the parking strategy goes to whether there's very special circumstances. So we're looking at those 2 points.
Those are one of the aspects. So the points that I gave evidence in chief on in relation to the very special circumstances for the Greenbelt are the 3 points that Mr. Melling has set out as what the airport constitute very special circumstances. There are 3 points there. One is that there is demand for parking. 2 is that there's nowhere else to put it. And 3 is that they need to grow the airport. I've clearly given evidence in relation to that. And the parking strategy and the alternative side go only to point 2 of very special circumstances, but I've raised evidence in relation to all 3 points.
In the section identified as alternative site details in your proof, you discuss the Heathfield Park proposal.
Yes.
You're quite right in pointing out it wasn't covered in the parking strategy, but it is covered in Mr. Melling's proof of evidence. So if we could take that up, please, at page 116.
Yes.
So here, Mr. Melling considers the site in relation to which your client submitted a planning application. And at paragraph 5.5.49 on page 117,
yes,
Mr. Melling sets out his conclusion, which is that the Heathfield Park site is not a suitable and available alternative. And this is on the basis of a likely lack of demand, the potential adverse impacts on highways, and the achievement of BAL's public transport mode share, the potential adverse environmental impacts, including flood risk, ecology, air and noise pollution and heritage, non-compliance with policies of the development plan, and uncertainty regarding deliverability of the facility. If we could that's what he says there. I will ask you a question, I'm just getting to it. If we could take up INQ 50, please.
Right. And that's documents submitted during the inquiry. 2 seconds. Yep.
So this is the notice of the decision in relation to the Heathfield Park site.
Yes.
And if we just look through this briefly, there are 11 reasons for refusal. These relate to non-compliance with the development plan or, principle of development, the demand, access, flood risk, noise and light, biodiversity, landscape archaeology, and a point about the scope of the environmental statement. These are substantially the same concerns as those that Mr. Melling has, aren't they?
I don't doubt the fact that they're the same as the parties were talking to each other throughout about my application. However, What Mr. Melling has said is a likely lack of demand for the P&R facility. And Mr. Melling is dealing with it in a different context to the local authority. The local authority are dealing with our planning application. Mr. Melling is dealing with whether or not there is an appropriate alternative site. Now, if we're going to explore the likelihood or not of whether that alternative appropriate site would get planning consent, then that's not an issue I understood the inspectors wanted to consider, but perhaps the inspectors could confirm that.
Don't worry, Ms Sutherland, we're not going to look at the merits of an appeal or anything else in relation to that site. I just wanted...
You're taking me to the reasons for refusal and trying to make the point that these reasons for refusal are similar to Mr. Melling's view, and Mr. Melling's view is this will get refused. That's his view. That, you know, that's not relevant to the Greenbelt sequential testing process in any way, is it?
We won't look at or debate the merits of those reasons for refusal. I put it to you that it is wholly reasonable for the airport to take the approach it has done in relation to the Heathfield Park site when those concerns have been borne out in the refusal of planning permission.
No, I disagree with you. I completely disagree with you. And the reason for that is that, as I've just pointed out, 5.5.49 in Mr. Melling's proof is in relation to the granting of planning consent for that site. That is not relevant for Greenbelt sequential testing, and accordingly, all that Mr. Melling has done there is list matters that could form reasons of refusal for the scheme. That doesn't mean it's not reasonably available, it simply means it doesn't have planning consent at the moment.
5.5.49 of Mr. Melling's proof, his view is that it's not a suitable and available site. We've looked at his reasons.
And I disagree with him, yes.
We've looked at his reasons and we've looked at the view of the local planning authority. I put it to you that it's reasonable for the airport to have formed its view on that proposal. I understand you disagree and I don't have any further questions on that, so thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Ms Noble, and thank you, Ms Sutherland. I think we're going to be hearing from you in a different context later on in the inquiry. Right, thank you both very much for that.
Sorry, sir, 2 seconds. Sorry to interrupt you. You're only going to be hearing from me, I think, in relation to conditions. We're still waiting to find out what's happening with the conditions day, aren't we?
Well, the conditions are being worked on by the authority. I think it's with the authority at the moment. No, I'm told it's with the airport at the moment. I'm hoping that the conditions are going to be coming out today.
Excellent. It's just obviously those are relevant, sir, for some of the points that all 6 partners are making. Absolutely.
I think it's with the airport then, Ms Noble, but unfortunately you're on your own there at the moment.
Sir, I don't have any evidence that that's not true, so I will have to check.
Very carefully phrased. Yeah, I think the position is there's a lot of work being done between the council and the airport. I'm certainly hoping that we'll get those conditions out later today, but certainly without fail during this week. Then, of course, the inquiry is not sitting for a week. The conditions session will be coming in the latter part of the week after that. But absolutely, there will be a full set of conditions, I hope, coming out well before that.
And sir, I'm sorry, just so that I'm clear, we will have Mr. Melling back on the first couple of days of that week, won't we? So is Mr. Melling to be discussing conditions, or are we doing a round table on conditions? It's just for my preparation of cross-examination.
No, Mr. Melling is coming back on the week beginning 28th September and giving his evidence, and on my list, you're down to cross-examine Mr. Melling on his evidence.
I am, yes.
And then subsequently, we'll be having a round table on conditions. There's bound to be an overlap between obviously what Mr. Melling says and what you ask him and the conditions session, but they're basically trying not to say two stabs at it, because obviously we don't want to repeat, but you'll get the opportunity to cross-examine Mr. Melling and then the opportunity to partake in the roundtable session on conditions.
Thank you very much, sir. I appreciate your help.
Okay, thank you very much. I think let's take an early lunch now, because the only other business we've got this week is, Miss Beth, your evidence in chief. Are you going to be led by Mr. Devas as before? No. Yep, you're on your own, okay? I'm on my own, yeah. Absolutely fine. Mr. Devas was doing the advocate role as a one-off, really. Absolutely fine. Okay, look forward to hearing from you. It's 12:05. Let's resume at 1 o'clock then, please.